Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for joining Climate Law and Governance Day 2022, and especially for joining this experts panel on activating decarbonization and adaptation in legal practice. It is with immense pleasure that I introduce Professor John Dernbach, Commonwealth Professor of Environmental Law and Sustainability at Widener University, Commonwealth Law School. Professor, I turn the session over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Maeve, and thank you to the sponsors, Marie Claire and everybody for inviting us to participate in this. We're talking all day long about different ways to use law to address climate change, and in this particular panel, we're going to take a very specific angle that is a little different from everything else you may have heard, and that is we're going to focus on the role of law associations, the groups that bring lawyers together and through which lawyers act not only on professional standards, but also with respect to advocacy and the conduct of the profession. We have four, and the question we're going to be asking today, is what can law associations do to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy, and particularly how can law associations use their role to help legal practitioners in that process, in their day-to-day work and whatever it is that they do across the wide range of things that lawyers do. And we're also committed, I think, as you probably have heard off and on today from different people, to the notion that every lawyer needs to play a role in this. It's not just climate lawyers or energy lawyers, it's also insurance lawyers and commercial lawyers and property lawyers and everyone else. And so when we talk about the role of law associations, we're talking about associations that bring in all of those constituencies and all of those groups. We have four distinguished speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them all at once and very briefly, and then what I'm going to do is tell you what the couple of questions are that we're going to have, and then a little bit more about how we proceed. So we're going to start with Laura Duversidis, who is the project manager with the International Bar Association in London, and who helped organize an amazing event similar to this one yesterday. Our next speaker is Alistair Cameron, who's with the Law Society of England and Wales. He is the policy advisor on planning and environmental law to the Law Society and played a very important role in the statement that the Law Society adopted on climate change. Our third speaker is Leticia Perón Campos Melo. She's with the National Brazilian Bar Association and legal counsel to that association. She's also secretary of the International Relations Committee of that bar association, and is representing that bar association here at COP27 and did the same thing at COP26. And finally, we're going to hear from Tracy Hester, who's with the University of Houston Law Center. He is co-director of the Center for Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Law at that center. The questions that I'm going to be asking each of the panelists I'm asking now is, what is your law association doing to get legal practitioners to lead advances in climate change mitigation and adaptation? And what additional steps should your law association consider to advance this effort? We'll go in the order in which folks were introduced. I'm hoping there's going to be a considerable amount of time that is left. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to those questions afterwards. Lara, we'll start with you.
Great. So hello to everyone that's listening. My name is Lara Duversidis, as John said. I thought that I would just give you perhaps just a bit more of a background of how I've come into this and, my history as a practitioner, and then a bit of detail about the International Bar Association where I work. So just to kick off, I am a lawyer admitted back in Australia. So I'm an Australian qualified lawyer who's practiced for the last 4 years at a commercial law firm in Australia. As an environment and planning lawyer, but also in disputes more broadly, having done an associateship with a judge prior to joining the firm. So I've only ever practiced as a lawyer, and only in the last few months have I accepted a job at the International Bar Association as a project lawyer. leading climate and business and human rights work within the Legal Policy and Research Unit that's headed up by Sarah Carnegie. And I guess it's an interesting transition for me, because I've gone from practicing law to being more of a project lawyer in an international setting. And the International Bar Association was established in 1947 to unify and to pull together every jurisdiction's voice, to be the voice of the global legal profession, basically. So it's a bit different from the traditional law society in the sense that it sits on top of and operates on top of the domestic law society, like Alistair, and separate again to Leticia's OIB or the American Bar Association. So in that sense, it's an amazing body, because we have contacts with every law association or bar association in the world. But what it means is that we don't have a direct connection necessarily to the individual practitioners, other than as officers of IBA thematic committees. Now, where climate change comes in is in 2020, the IBA released a climate crisis statement approved by the then president. And it was really an outlining of the acknowledgement of the IBA of climate change and the role that lawyers can play in it. Now that I've come on board, as John mentioned, there's been a number of activities, two large events, one yesterday and one tomorrow in the Blue Zone, which I'll put a link. Hopefully we can share it, because we'd love for you to come along. But, to really help answer this question of, what can lawyers be doing? And so I guess when I say, what can lawyers be doing? It's because I come from the perspective of being an advocate. Now, Alistair, as the Law Society Policy Officer for Climate Change, will have a different approach, because he occupies a very important role there. But in terms of what the IBA can do to help bolster knowledge with lawyers, I think what we're going to look to do after COP finishes is develop training tools, like we've done with the business and human rights wing of the IBA, to help upskill lawyers on climate law. So rather than try and teach, tax lawyers about the tax implication of climate change, it will be taking it a step back and really explaining the nuts and bolts of the Paris Agreement, for example, which can then, I guess, practitioners can use that, in their daily practice. Because we've got to assume here that we need to upskill all lawyers on the different nuts and bolts of international climate law, and let them read that into their existing practice. That's really where I see the value add. But as I said, it's something that we're in development at the moment, and certainly something that will be informed by our working group that we've established in the lead up to COP27, and something that will continue to develop in the lead up to COP28. Thanks, John.
Okay, Alistair, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. And thank you to Climate Law and Governance Day for having me here today. Right now I am in the Blue Zone. Hopefully my internet connection stays and maintains. And I've got a small protest, I think, which has maybe appeared out of nowhere when it was quiet before. So please forgive me if there's any issues there. But exactly, building upon what Lara said. So the Law Society of England and Wales followed along the leadership from the American Bar Association and the International Bar Association by publishing a climate change resolution in 2021, just in advance of COP26. Now, the resolution does reference adaptation, but most of the actions that we've taken thus far as a bar have been mitigation focused. The primary piece of work that we've been focusing on is climate change guidance to the profession. Now, when we came into this position and when we were drafting the resolution, there was a question as to what is the most impactful area that a law association can have. And I think from conversations with my international colleagues at different bars, it's clear that every single organization has a bespoke position to take and a bespoke challenge to deal with. But one that we saw was key for us to deal with in light of the kind of key conversations which were going on in England and Wales at the time and still are going on, was ethical and professional duties guidance for solicitors on how climate change interacts with that. So just briefly what this guidance covers, and this guidance is still in draft and we're hoping to publish it hopefully at the start of next year. So it covers how climate legal risk manifests, so how climate risk impacts the law. Secondly, it talks about, well, if you understand what climate legal risk is, are you competent to advise on this? Think about how climate change is impacting your area of law, and also the broader ethical issues that your professional conduct duties require you to think about when you're operating as a trusted officer of the court. And then lastly, the more broader questions on, how does that impact your client intake? What does that mean in terms of greenwashing and your firm's credentials? These are key issues that solicitors in England, Wales are facing, and we think that a professional body can hopefully provide some clear guidance on that. That being said, one thing I just quickly want to highlight is, of course, that law society is, much like the other bars or law societies, access to justice and rule of law is paramount, and therefore we do recognize that all clients do deserve legal representation, but we're more thinking about what that might look like rather than saying that such a client should or should. So the other things I just briefly want to touch upon that we're working on is looking at how climate change impacts different areas of the law. So we're looking at conveyancing law, commercial law, and property leases. And again, this is another area where, key areas that our practitioners will look to their professional membership body to look for guidance and understanding how the fast-moving climate agenda is impacting their area of practice. We're also developing a net zero protocol for law firms so that they understand how to operate their law firm in a way which is aligned with SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, and set net zero targets which are in line with international standards. We've also collaborated internationally, as Lara mentioned. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to collaborate and be here on this stage with my colleagues at fellow bars. And then lastly as well, we continue to engage in policy consultation work where climate change impacts the rule of law. And that is something that we view is a key mechanism that the rule of law can play in making sure that the legislative targets set by the UK government are upheld and legitimate policy strategies are in place to fulfill the legislative requirements. So yeah, back over to you, John. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alistair. That sounds like a lot, and we're going to have, I think we'll come back and unpack some of that a little later on, but that's a really nice overview. Leticia, you're next.
Okay. Hi, hello, everyone. I'm Leticia Campos Melo, representative of the Brazilian National Bar Association at COP27. So I'm going to quickly give a small background about OAB, because I think it's important that in this international setting, everybody can better know what OAB can do in Brazil. So OAB is the main representative of the civil society in Brazil. OAB has constitutional prerogatives stated in our constitution to protect the democratic rule of law and human rights. So that means that in our constitution, we have prerogatives and tools to address lawsuits directly in the Supreme Court of Brazil. So human rights the Brazilian jurisprudence has already considered the right for a climate stability as a human right. So let's say that this is inside of OAB prerogatives as well. So given this background, I would also like to say that OAB has, it's one only organization that represents 1.2 million lawyers in Brazil, that has sub-organizations under the national organization in each one of our states. We have established in the national OAB, we have established a special committee for climate change. This special committee is currently working in launching a national plan to assist lawyers and law firms in reducing the footprint of their own business, but also the footprint of OAB nationally and also in its subnationals. I am personally working with inside of my committee, which is the International Relations Committee of OAB, together with the Law Society in England and Wales, ABA, and ABA, taking into account what they have done already and using it to draft a recommendation from OAB to all lawyers in Brazil. So this is very advanced. We are in a final draft. We are hoping that we are going to have this approved by our organization in the beginning of next year. And inside of this recommendation, we are addressing that OAB and lawyers should actively participate in propositions of law and climate policies. We are touching the necessity of OAB to act sometimes in lawsuits concerning mitigation and adaptation in respect to climate crisis. We are also touching the subject that lawyers should incorporate better practice to reduce greenhouse emissions in their organizations, in their law firms. And most special, we are also giving the recommendation to lawyers to advise clients in respect to responsibilities caused in the climate. So they should advise that to their clients, and as well as being a lawyer, an in-house lawyer, advise companies about it. And we are deciding to also give recommendations for law firms in a certain size, because Brazil is very broad. So we have small law firms, we have individual lawyers, but we also have the large law firms. So we are also giving some instructions to the large firm in respect to greenhouse emissions. And since I don't have so much more time, we are looking at further steps. And, we have the further steps of approving this recommendation, of, launching our plan for advising law firms, but also we want to act as we have this prerogative as well in respect to the law education in Brazil, meaning that we want to get in touch with the universities and put the climate issue, the climate law, more into all the subjects taught in universities, in law school universities. So this is where we stand now in OAB Brazil. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Letitia. That sounds like you've got a lot going on, a particular, at a very high level of detail in terms of what you're going to be helping practitioners with. Tracy, you're next.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with such an august panel, and as always, it's a bit of a challenge to be the last speaker because they've laid out so much information and ground. But I'm here to discuss what the American Bar Association in the United States is undertaking when it regards to climate change. The American Bar Association is a voluntary bar membership that represents the industry voice of 1.3 million lawyers in the United States. So when the American Bar Association takes a position, it's usually after some very measured and deliberate evaluation and a formal process that's meant to solidify and respect the voice of everybody in the association. In that regard for climate change, we've actually had several different resolutions and actions by the ABA on sustainability, as well as directly on climate change, going back to 1991. We've even had a climate change resolution in place since 2008. I'd like to talk a little bit, though, about the one that we just passed. In 2019, the House of Delegates for the American Bar Association passed a new updated resolution on what the American Bar thinks we should be doing about climate change. In that regard, it was a full vetted process that went through our entire House of Delegates and received a formal vote of approval. So it is an official position statement for the American Bar Association, reflects a pretty solid commitment. Effectively, the resolution has several key points. One is that the American Bar Association formally endorses action on climate change at a legislative level, as well as at a state level and different other types of policies. So as a matter of substance, the bar is weighing in and says that the United States should be doing more about climate change as a political entity. But as for lawyers in particular, The ABA has also said that lawyers individually should be undertaking actions in regard to climate change and their practice. These obligations and these urgings fall into different categories. One is that the resolution urges lawyers to take steps to the extent they can to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions in the way they practice law. I suspect we're going to talk about that in our panel discussion in regards to some of the other activities taking place in the Net Zero Alliance. Talk about the way lawyers practice law and the impact that might have on greenhouse gas emissions. Second, the resolution also specifically talks about how lawyers should undertake pro bono activities to promote action to help combat climate change. And also, it talks about how lawyers have an obligation to advise their clients in regard to climate change, and urges strongly that lawyers need to be educated and able to provide competent legal advice to their clients in all subject matter areas as to how climate change could affect them. I wanted to note in passing that a shout out to John Dernbach, our moderator, and that he has been working with Mike Gerard at the Sabin Center for Climate Change on outlining different types of legal pathways to deep decarbonization that focuses on different recommendations and changes to law specifically that need to be engaged in at the national and state level in all sectors to promote the deepest possible decarbonization in both industry and other types of economic practice. And hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of those aspects as well during our panel discussion. These resolutions matter. The latest resolution 111, the one that was passed in 2019, reflects the judgment of the ABA that private action is going to be necessary to help accomplish the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement. And lawyers are part of that voluntary action. When you think about 1.3 million lawyers representing economic actors throughout the US economy and the global economy, the hope is that that voice could have a pretty important impact. Now, translating that resolution to action is important because a lot of resolutions might theoretically end up on the shelf. To keep that from happening, the American Bar Association has set up a climate change task force, which John and I both sit on. That task force meets routinely, and one of its jobs, in conjunction with our Climate Change Sustainable Development Committee, is prepare a periodic report that goes directly to the American Bar president. And he or she reviews it, usually on either a 2-week cycle that has all of the updates of important legal activities that affect climate change and what the bar should be doing about it. That has also led to further work within the bar, including publications by the ABA dealing with sustainability practice. But the arc is that we have to report back. In 5 years after the 2019 resolution, in other words, in 2 years, 2024, we have to report back to the House of Delegates on how the resolution has been implemented, what sort of ground we've covered, and whether or not that resolution should be revitalized and updated to reflect the situation. So it is designed to be evergreen and to reflect action that is going to be on an ongoing basis. Now, before I go, before my time runs out, I did want to make sure I captured the fact that we are not the only actor here. The American Bar Association is a voluntary organization at the national level, but every state bar has also got its own mandatory membership bar, and many of them are extremely active on climate change issues. And we can talk about some of the things that District of Columbia, Maryland, Hawaii, New York, Oregon are all undertaking to engage their members on competent climate change advising practices, as well as things they can do about the way they practice law to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. And there's increasing focus among all of us on what the ethical obligations for lawyers are to competently practice on climate change issues, and how those ethical issues translate in different ways in terms of making sure lawyers do not put themselves into the middle of climate change advising scenarios. And that is increasingly a concern because as the issue, particularly with ESG, becomes more spotlighted in political discussions, we're finding that some political actors, including US senators, are sending letters to law firms urging that lawyers are going to be under some discussion for their roles in ESG counseling, and lawyers need to think about both what they're saying, how they're saying it, and how important it is to defend it when they come under that sort of scrutiny. So with that, we've got a lot to talk about, John, and I'll pass the microphone back to you.
Okay, great. So there's a question I see in the chat from Lara. And in your capacity development plans, are you thinking of including national government legal professionals?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So thank you, Valerie from Canada, who works for the United Nations. Yes, the IBA is, I'm not sure that, yeah, call them capacity development plans. We've not worded them as such. It's a bit more free-flowing than that, but certainly looking to engage in training all lawyers. You know, we don't just look at commercial lawyers. We represent the voice of all lawyers. And we would definitely be looking at engaging national government legal professionals as much as they would want to engage with us. And certainly we do have lawyers from government on different thematic committees that the IBA has. And we would be looking to engage our officers, and, you know, many of them are government lawyers. So yes.
So there's another question. Thank you, Lara. There's another question for all the panelists about what steps your respective associations are taking toward fostering cooperation with counterpart associations in developing countries to raise awareness about climate change issues. And Alistair, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, and I'll have to give a quick answer on that. When we had that conversation at COP26 last year, and we kind of came together as bars thinking about climate change, from a unified point of view, that was one of the key things we thought about, to make sure that we are equitable in our action, to make sure that we are getting a global jurisdictions, a global perspective from jurisdictions who would be represented. We have and will continue to reach out to bars all around the world, and thankfully at COP27, that's something I feel that we have achieved. And I'm looking forward to seeing what might come from that. So yes, it's something that we definitely are concerned about and wish to achieve as a long-term vision.
Letitia, I'm not sure how to describe Brazil, developed or developing, but I'll let you sort that out. And I think but probably I'm particularly interested in your answer to the question is, what about other bars in South and Central America?
Yes, I think that this started exactly as following this question. When we met, we could have done something individually as bars associations, but we decided at COP26 to engage with the representatives of each one of those four that are here today to try to launch something for COP27. So let's say that in COP26, we didn't have anything, and, you know, we engaged in COP26 to organize something together. So we had an event yesterday. Well, I invite you all to, you know, participate in our event, let's say tomorrow, which is the 12th. And the idea is that for COP28, we would have more bar associations from other countries and from developing countries too, gathering with us and, you know, and pushing this agenda forward. And I can say that I am like a OAB is an example of this, because I've met people from Law Society of England and Wales, because I met the representatives of ABBA from IBA. I was able to know what they were doing, and I was able to study what they were doing, and, you know, I was able to get whatever they were doing, then put it in my jurisdiction in the way that my jurisdiction could accept. So it's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for having more people that have and work inside of their law associations, that have a word inside of, a voice inside their law associations, that want to join us and see the work that we have done already and try to bring this to their jurisdiction in a way that can be accepted, and move on and make this international movement. So that's the whole idea that we have here, to engage other bar associations. And I think that OAB has a lot of relationships in South America. So our idea, especially from the committee that I represent here today, and from OAB National, we want to engage more African countries that we have a wonderful relationship and even the same language sometimes. And we want to engage South American too, bar associations that are, close colleagues of ours. So this is really something that we are looking, doing this kind of events is to those international bar associations to reach out to us and participate on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Letitia. That's very helpful. Tracy, anything you want to add?
Hold on one sec. Absolutely. I'll just say that when we got together in Glasgow, Johnny might need to mute there.
Oh.
Thank you. When we got together in Glasgow, the plan was all along to try and be as inclusive as possible. So this is an iterative process. I think the plan is that we're looking ahead. For the next COP, we're hoping to organize another event and to have that event include even more bars. Even in this particular one, when we had our session yesterday, we had representatives from Mozambique, from Nigeria. In prior discussions, I know we've reached out to India and other bars. I think that the overall goal is ultimately to just throw as broad a net as we can and bring as many voices as we can, because lawyers in every jurisdiction are going to be wrestling with the same issues in terms of climate change.
Lara.
Yeah, I think that this is the start of something really that has potential to be really far-reaching, and certainly us lawyers together are going to be filling a necessary space. I think certainly this is my first COP. I know that the rest of you on this call either met at Glasgow last year or connected after Glasgow. But for me, my journey is just starting now, and certainly with fresh eyes. It surprised me how few lawyers were on the ground, particularly in the blue zone, although there were more lawyers obviously in negotiation rooms, but those poor guys don't really get out much. They're very busy inside representing their country. So there's clearly a need. And if you look on the blue zone event list for this year, of the 200 to 300 sessions, only 1% to 2% of them involve the role of lawyers, which, if you think about the fact that this COP's slogan is together for implementation, that's a real void, because you can't implement anything without legal assistance, because for better or for worse, lawyers are everywhere, and we are needed to assist all communities in adjusting to a lower carbon emitting future. So that's certainly where I think we can add value. And I think there is going to be the need for sessions for lawyers to upskill, and certainly sessions for us to bring together as many bar associations as possible to get that message across. And as Professor Tracy Hester has said, the more that we can connect with people who have genuine interest, who show drive, who want practical solutions to this, the better. And I welcome how much we can do at COP28. And I'm just really excited to hit the ground running with the sessions that we're going to hold even before that.
Yeah, I think it's important. Thank you, Lara. I think it's important to point out maybe underline what's already been said, which is this COP is the first time lawyers have gotten together as law associations. And Tracy and Alistair and Letitia, I think, sort of set the groundwork for that last year in Glasgow. And this year we're building on that. And I would just invite anyone who is listening who represents a bar association or might want to involve a bar association or law association to contact those of us who are speaking on the panel today, because we're all part of a core group that has been planning the COP27 events for a while now, and we'd love to hear from you. There was a question, Tracy, for you. Does your guidance include what lawyers should not do by way of action to thwart legal and policy measures to advance climate action?
The ABA resolution itself does not, it tends to couch it in terms of positive action. So there's not a lot of explicit discussion about lawyers should not do, but outside the resolution, there's obviously quite a bit of discussion about making sure that as part of your ethical duties, there are certain minimum things you need to do, which implication dictates there are certain things you should not do. For example, it's, I think, universally agreed that to competently advise your client as pursuant to that model rules and ethics, you have to be educated and sophisticated to speak credibly on climate change impacts to that field of practice. And you bear a separate duty as well to tell the client truthful advice regarding those situations, even if that client doesn't want to hear it. So the negative implication of that is you obviously can't advise, you can't fail to undertake that self-education. You can't fail or willfully refuse to see the need to address that situation with a client if the client doesn't want to hear it. And you know, without having it spelled in the resolution, I think it's pretty clear as the subtext that those negative commands are also involved.
Does anybody want to add anything to that? Thank you, Tracy. But does anybody want to add anything to that about your particular, the resolutions at your particular association or the statements that they've made? Alistair, let's start with you.
Could you just repeat the question there? I think you cut off a little bit for me there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
That's okay. Yeah, I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, so the original question to Tracy, but I think it's worth asking everybody, is does the guidance or statement that your association adopted include statements about what lawyers should not do?
No, I suppose it depends on your framing as to whether you're going to view it as a positive thing or a negative thing, right? Like, I think we published the resolution from a positive perspective, thinking that this is something that we would urge lawyers to engage with. So I think on that basis alone, it's telling you to go further than perhaps you're approaching your practice currently. Now, in terms of things that you should not do, I think that is something which is a bit more complex. And I think that's something that we're going to be maybe, as I said in our guidance, looking at to a certain degree for our members. But I think it is important for our institutions to figure out the kind of the rails that, you know, solicitors should be operating on to a certain degree. But at the same time, I don't think we can go so far as to say, as some, you know, firms might go and say that they're not representing certain clients. I think that's up for an individual solicitor or an individual firm to think about. And on that, I would say that, you know, from at least in England and Wales, in terms of your regulatory duties, you are entitled to, as a solicitor, compared to, for example, barristers, to decline to act on a certain matter. So I think that the should not and the more ethically based should not, I think, depend a little bit more on the solicitor.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Thank you. I might jump in there and say, you know, lawyers are not politicians. Lawyers aren't necessarily policy makers. We are guided by our legal duties, and our legal duties differ depending on which jurisdiction we were sworn into. So in Australia, when I took my oath, it was to the court first and foremost, and then to the client. And we, as lawyers, we promote our client's best interest, but we must not mislead the court, and we must always honour our duty to the court. And I think the Bar Council of England and Wales says it well. And this is acknowledging, of course, in common law systems that barristers and solicitors have different rules placed upon them. Barristers, you know, have a first cab rank rule, whereas solicitors do not, right? And I acknowledge that this conversation is different for Leticia in Brazil, and you know, this conversation is different for every jurisdiction. Certainly, I'm just speaking from, I guess, my view as a lawyer in a common law jurisdiction. So the UK Bar Council says we must promote fearlessly and by all proper and lawful means the lay client's best interests, and to do so without regard to our own interests. We cannot risk diminishing the trust and confidence which the public places in their lawyers and in the profession more generally. And I stand by that statement quite firmly. And the key words here, I think, is promoting fearlessly by all proper and lawful means. And as we know throughout history, what is proper and lawful changes. Changes can dramatically on the tide, and the tide certainly here is shifting in climate. What is proper and lawful is changing, and we as lawyers have a duty to our client to promote their best interests. And of course, the world's best interest is to transition very swiftly into the best possible way, and upholding the Paris Agreement, and certainly each individual country's NDCs. But we are there always to guide clients, and I think we should always remember that, and remember that we are impartial, and no matter how much the fight may sink into perhaps red herrings, as Tracy alluded to, letters to law firms, we must remember that we are not politicians, and we are officers of the court. And I think if we can keep that in mind, if we can build educational tools for lawyers, if we can increase capacity. I know that the pledge that was made through the Climate Law and Justice Initiative of increasing capacity of international climate lawyers from 600 to 6,000 in the next few years, it depends on that education. And that's partly why we're here today, to talk about that, the role of law, and certainly something we'll be focusing on in the lead up to COP28 next year. And I want to say, and Leticia, I'm so moved by everything that you've done at the OAB, and, as a lawyer from, a global South jurisdiction, that we have to meet every law association where they are. We have to acknowledge that different laws exist on the ground. And I was listening to an earlier session where I think it was Professor Robert Kabugi from the University of Nairobi said, you cannot expect to transplant laws from the global north into the global south. And necessarily that from Caio Borges from the ICS in one of our panels yesterday, that, lawyers are looking and learning from each other, particularly in the climate space, particularly with respect to climate litigation. But what works in one jurisdiction may not work in another. And that's where I think morals can trip us up. If we always look at by, guiding by all proper and lawful means in a way that's lawful for each jurisdiction, that's where we're going to make the most traction. And the best way we can upskill lawyers to learn about the Paris Agreement and top-down approaches, I think the better. So that's it from me.
So Leticia, you described in a fair bit of detail a lot of the guidance that your association is going to be developing for lawyers. And in the context, and I'm curious about whether the guidance that you're developing has any, what somebody yesterday at our previous event described as red lines, things that lawyers should not do by way of action.
No, it is very important that I say as well that it is a recommendation. So that means that it's not an obligation for lawyers. That's much more dealing with awareness and also with good practice. And I just want to also make a point in respect, I'm saying to Brazil, I mean, we have a lot of laws, and not just like primary and secondary laws related to climate and environment, but we also have this right for climate stated, let's say, for the healthy climate stated in our constitution. So what I want to say is that we actually, even if you are a lawyer and you are not like politically, crazy about climate, and if you're not like someone that believes that the world needs to do something, even if you don't, I mean, it's clear that there is some risk for clients, and it's clear that lawyers, they have to appoint such risks. So I think if you want to be like a good lawyer and also represent well your client, you need to capacitate yourself in climate law, because this is going to be necessary. Otherwise, you're not doing a good job. So it's not that you're making a favor for climate. That would be wonderful. Lots of us that are here today, we love the cause, we believe in that. but I think it's very important to be clear that there's this duty of care with the client, of representing his best interest. And this is part of the new game in law. I mean, if you want to do a good job, if you want to protect your client,
Did she freeze, or is it just me?
Me too. Is John also frozen?
Yeah. Oh my God. Is it us?
for
Okay. We've just.
Can we continue the conversation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to pick up there just quickly with what Leticia was saying about duties of care. And, you know, it's not for us to necessarily judge our clients, but to be there to assist them the best way possible to make decisions that properly conceptualize risks. And I think that's one of the main problems at the moment with bringing, you know, large corporations up to speed. And certainly I've represented a number of them in my time in practice, is properly conceptualizing risk, both financial and reputational. And in the climate space, whether you dig your head in the sand or not, it's coming, and we need to best prepare our clients, whether they want to hear it or not. If we don't do our job to fashion them with the best available information based on the best available science to properly inform them of risk, then we're not doing our jobs. And I agree with Leticia on that 100%.
Just one small thing to add to that, entirely agree with Laura and Leticia as well, is that if you advise your client of the negative risks associated with, you know, taking a certain course of conduct, whether they be legal risks or they be you know, reputational, whatever, you know, your solicitor at that point has fulfilled their duty of care, and you know the client can then choose that level of risk. So you're not responsible at the next steps, but in terms of what you are responsible for is flagging that. That's, I think, what we're trying to maybe get at.
Yeah, and in legal advices, you know, you step out what you have and what you have not considered, right? You have expressed letters of engagement, and you know that's where there's some really interesting projects. And Alistair, I'd love it if you could talk about the Chancery Lane project, perhaps tweaking, you know, what we have as standard pro forma documents to be more, I guess you would say, climate conscious. But I don't mean that in a morality sense, but more in a legal conception of risk sense. So Alistair, I might flick it over to you to talk about that.
Actually, sorry, Alistair, if I could just jump in very quickly. There's a question from a member of the audience, Professor Marcus Gehring at the University of Cambridge, and he's asking if there is a growing discussion how it could become unethical to advise fossil fuel companies or just coal companies. What do members of the panel think about that? What if the particular fossil fuel in question is prohibited in my country? Would you be able to speak to that?
I think we lost.
Yeah.
Would anyone like to take that question?
Yeah. Well, if I understand the question correctly, if a certain fuel is illegal in the country, well, of course, that's a material risk that you must advise your client on, right? And I think that it could be unethical, particularly if you know your duties, if you're not honoring your duties to the court and to the client in attempting to fashion perhaps a stream of revenue that just is not viable anymore, right? Like to ignore the best available science, to ignore key judgments. Yes, that would be unethical because you would be breaching your duties as a solicitor, and it would potentially, and I say this as a solicitor in a common law country, but you know, there have been a number of key decisions in relation to the climate, and certainly I know Germany has had one key case where, you know, the court were very clear about the trajectory of the planet, you know, the circumstances in which our children are going to be left if, you know, if the status as normal continues. So I completely agree that you know, it is a matter of ethics as far as the duties that the lawyers have to occupy may be breached. And I certainly see that potentially as a new form of perhaps not like seed litigation, but disciplinary action if a lawyer has so missed a material risk. And I think that's a conversation that it seems to me that, you know, there's two spheres of lawyers at the moment, ones that are sticking by the books in terms of ethical duties, and one that are moving beyond into this climate conscious lawyering from a moral duty. And I think that as a profession, we're going to have to confront that conversation. And I certainly see arguments for both, although I would repeat the comment that lawyers are not politicians, but based on the best available science, really, the risk is very clear. We are very much in trouble, and it's our duties as legal professionals, as officers of the court, to make that point as clear as possible to every company and to every person.
So can you all hear me?
Yes.
We can
Am I
hear you,
back?
John.
Okay, sorry. Tracy and I are sharing the same room, and the internet just cut out for us. So we've missed the last 5 to 7 minutes of what you had to say.
No, the guts of it was the Neubauer decision. The question was, you know, whether or not it might be unethical not to act in this space, if I understood it correctly. And I was saying, you know, the Neubauer decision in Germany makes it very clear how disastrous life will be if we do not swiftly act to adjust, you know, all. Oh, sorry, my Zoom is, oh, here we go. Sorry. If we do not adjust quite swiftly and if we do not properly conceptualize risk of climate, risk to our clients, risk to revenue streams, risk to our health, risk to our life. And lawyers are in the best position, I think, to do that in a way that is objective.
Okay, that's great. So that's helpful. So, and again, my apologies for something I can't control, which is the internet. One question that was on the chat before we lost, before our internet went down, is somebody was asking, are you optimistic about the role of lawyers in making a difference on climate change? And Letitia, why don't we start with you?
You're on mute.
If you can say it again, John, because my connection was off.
Okay, sorry. The question before our internet went down that was on the chat was, how optimistic are you about the role of lawyers in making a difference on climate change?
I think it's the role of everyone in the world. So I think it's really something that it's not a role of anyone alone. It's not a role of just one government, of not all governments. It's not a role of one person. It's the role of everyone and every institution, every organization, every corporation. I think we are like, it's the fight for humanity, you know? So if we think about how much suffering countries in the global south are having at this moment, if you think about how African mothers, you know, are suffering, you know, because when you say about raising the temperature in the planet, you have impacts that are completely different depending where you are. So 1.5 to maybe something in Canada, but it's not the same in Africa. So, you know, I think that this is something that every single person has to find. It's in your profession and in your everyday life, how you can help. And I think lawyers have a very important role because there's no transaction relevant in the world that is made without a lawyer. So, and at the point that every single transaction is made and you have a lawyer and the lawyer can navigate climate law, that means that he's able to advise well the client. He's able to point out risks for the client. So do a good job for your own client, but also to the world. And I think that also lawyers that point out risks in corporation, that means that the higher administration, so the board members, they have to be aware of those risks and then they are accountable for such risks. So I think that I do believe the lawyers have a very important role and that we have been out of this. And I think we have to step in, especially because now we are not in a moment anymore of new agreements, of new treaties. We have all done. I think we are in the moment of implementation, and implementation means if people don't act, you have to search for justice. So when things are not working, when you have minorities, that have no rights, which is the case for a lot of vulnerable people in the global South, and nothing is done, you have justice. So I mean, now we are in the moment that, lawyers cannot be out anymore. Lawyers have to step into COP, and we have to work for the implementation. So I think we have an important role.
Well, thank you, Letitia. Alistair, what would you add?
Yeah, no, I think I don't think I could say more than what my other fellow panelists have said on that question to add, other than endorsing what they have said.
It might be great, Alistair, if you take this moment, and I know Estelle Dion KC has asked you to answer the question about and to discuss Chancery Lane project as an example of like practical application of what we're talking about in terms of adjusting pro forma documents and adjusting to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, but in a local and very practical, very swift sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What I will say to all panelists, sorry, not all, to all participants, if you're in England and Wales, it does fill me quite a bit with pride on this, that I do think that England and Wales is really rich in initiatives which are geared towards for lawyers. I mean, not only is this event today indicative of that, but also in terms of capacity building, but we've got a whole host of fantastic initiatives out there. One of which I think, the Chancery Lane project is absolutely fantastic. Its purpose is to essentially rewire contracts to be net zero aligned. This can be in a whole host of different areas, whether it be in transport, infrastructure, insurance, all the host of different areas. And what is fantastic about what the Chancery Lane project does is that not only is it an immediate action through a contractual change, but also all of their contract clauses are completely free, and they're a complete non-profit organization, and they've been drafted by some of the most bright leading legal minds in England and Wales. What I would say to add to that is that if you're from another jurisdiction, I do know that they are beginning to transpose their clauses to other jurisdictions. So if there are any American colleagues dialing in, please do get in touch with them or get in touch with myself. I would be pleased to pass you along so that we can continue in transposing their fantastic clauses into other jurisdictions to elicit climate action. Just to say very briefly, in other initiatives, there's the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, which is composed of a host of different firms and getting them to be 1.5 degree aligned. There's the Lawyers for Net Zero, which is particularly for in-house counsel, and I would recommend any in-house lawyers having a look at that. It's specifically looking at the unique role that they fulfill. There is the Legal Sustainability Alliance for law firms. There's a whole host of other ones, maybe in the follow-up materials I could provide, but please do get in touch if you want. And the other thing I would just briefly, lastly, like to say, thanks to Estelle for the question, is the Bar Council are also doing fantastic guidance on this issue and are doing fantastic work and assembling its climate crisis working group on this issue. So I think we're extremely lucky that we've got such committed and dedicated and bright leading minds in the legal sector in England and Wales who are really leading the charge on thinking about the role of lawyers in mitigating the climate crisis.
Well, thank you for that, Alistair. One question that has come up throughout, and the Chancery Lane project is part of it, but Letitia raised it, pretty much everybody raised it one way or another. A lot of what we're talking about from the different law associations is providing guidance to lawyers, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of lawyers are going to be interested in this guidance and are going to be happy to receive it. And if they don't agree with every piece of it, they'll adapt it to their own use and purposes. And I think that's almost certainly true. But there's also a kind of a take it or leave it quality to this, and we know from conversations we've all had with different lawyers that not everybody is going to want to accept this advice. And so I guess the question that leads to is, what ethical obligation do lawyers have to address climate change in their practice, to advise clients on a day-to-day basis about this, about risks and opportunities? And because Tracy alluded to this earlier, I'd like to start with Tracy.
Sure, and I think that there are a couple of predicates we could start with. First of all, and I'm sorry, John, you might need to mute again. Okay, I'm sorry. So with that, I'm sorry, I'm getting a feedback, so I'm going to speak slowly and deliberately. Bear with me. So in terms of ethical obligations, first of all, it is clear that there will be ethical obligations related in terms of providing competent climate advice. There's no surprises there. If we look at the existing, in the United States, existing bases for requiring competent climate advice, there's clearly a duty of candor, there's a duty of self-education, there's a specific duty as well providing rightful representation in the sense of that you are representing legitimate interest of your client, and that's subject typically to a rule of reason standard. So where the ethical issues are looking particularly interesting at this initial stage, and where the bar associations may play a role, is where the advice the lawyer is giving is now being injected into the center of claims against the client. So the lawyer's role is actually actively part of the claim. So I mentioned previously that we've already had at least one letter that was issued by a group of 5 senators, the US senators, against a group of 31 law firms providing ESG advice, specifically alleging that that advice was part of a collusive anti-competitive conspiracy, and that as a result, this conspiracy was designed to suppress fossil fuel energy production. The letter actually alerted those law firms to initiate a litigation hold on their documents. So your advice and your ethical duties are going to be squarely at the heart of that legal issue if it ever actually matures into either an oversight hearing or a full-scale lawsuit. But also we've seen in the past as well, and this is perhaps reaching back in history, but some of the climate tort lawsuits, particularly the initial wave in the United States that was brought under federal common law before the US Supreme Court ruled those claims were all displaced by the Clean Air Act. But those initial lawsuits included civil conspiracy counts. Those civil conspiracy counts were frankly designed to include lawyers within the alleged conspiracy so that privileged communications might be subject to challenge as part of that enterprise. So the ethical duty to provide not only candid and accurate and competent advice, but also advice related to a lawful, legitimate purpose of the client is squarely, that ethical duty is squarely at the heart of the legal disputes that are going to be on the horizon. And with that, that's what's going on in the United States, but I feel like I suspect others would like to talk about what's happening in their respective jurisdictions.
Yeah, I might just jump in there quickly, and Tracy, 100%. And I think it was actually, I think it was 51 law firms, which is even more surprising and problematic, frankly, that has happened, particularly in relation to antitrust law. And I know that antitrust law is a hot topic right now in the sense of whether or not you can transition a market if it causes competition issues. Do you cease doing it? And that requires competent legal advice, which hopefully those 5 senators get. But you're laughing. But I just wanted to point out on the Q&A, Valerie made a very good point, and I'd like to speak to it quickly about the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Absolutely great point. Pillar 2 is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and certainly it's interesting. I think it ties into a broader conversation of a rights-based approach to climate-related issues. And certainly, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, that will make more or less sense. You know, a rights-based approach in Brazil means something very different to in Australia, for example, because in Australia there is no federal human rights act, whereas in Brazil the constitution is very robust, having been rewritten in the 20th century. And you know, only in the time, you know, to match, I guess, like contemporary views of society, versus in Australia the constitution was written in 1901. So but regardless, the Ruggie principles, or the UNGPs as you may know them, exist, and lawyers, I think, will see more incorporation of them in advice work, and we'll see more litigation, I think, disputing or perhaps like making justiciable sections of the UNGPs. And I saw actually that an international law association for business and human rights was launched this week in Geneva, which is really exciting. And you can see, I think, you know, the increased knowledge and the increased discussion of UNGPs applying in everyday life in domestic settings where perhaps, you know, rights-based approaches aren't taken. So I agree entirely. That's certainly another piece of the puzzle. Perhaps another, you know, if we're all trying to bake a cake here, it's just an additional ingredient that that we must use.
Letitia, did I ask you this question about the ethical aspect of this?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I guess what I'd like to do is go around and ask if anybody has any concluding thoughts about where we ought to go next. And Tracy, let's start with you, and I'll be sure to turn my sound down.
Sure. I think I'll just offer perhaps a perspective, which is I'm based in Houston. I practiced in Houston for many years, and I'm very aware that there's a different perspective out among many other attorneys who have a different sense of the importance of climate change. And I think we need to be aware and sensitive to the fact that we have a pretty diverse audience of practitioners, because oftentimes it's easy to forget that we talk to folks we associate with, but there's others outside who have a different perspective. What I would convey to them is, regardless of whatever their persuasions or beliefs, the objective data are very clear, that climate change is going to increasingly become a central part of whatever field of practice they do: real estate, corporate transactions, insurance, criminal law even. And as a result, just as a simple matter of putting everything else to the side, being a good ethical lawyer requires you've got to have that skill set. And it's the bar association's jobs in all of our respective jurisdictions to get that message across in a way that people will internalize and help them actually carry it out. So that's my take-home message for folks heading back home from COP.
Thank you, Professor Tracy. Thank you to all that were speaking today. And thank you, Professor Dernbach, for a great session. We've got to jump off the session, unfortunately, because the next plenary is starting on the dot in 1 minute. So hopefully we'll see you online for that. But we greatly appreciate all of the insights of the speakers and the discussants in this session.